Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of 3 at 3 on Solar PV. I'm Jenn Runyon, Chief Editor of Renewable Energy World.
And I'm Paula, Chief Market Research Analyst, SPV Market Research.
Awesome. We're going to talk about three cool topics today, we hope. Nevada net metering.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about some kind of ridiculousness in North Carolina.
Weird news.
And then Africa Solar.
Yes, interesting news.
So let's start with Nevada net metering. Okay, let's give some people background if they don't know what's going on. Can you lay it out, Paula?
Well, everybody in the solar industry, I would hope, knows that there's net on the DG side of things, knows that there are changes state by state by state by state. Nevada is, and well, Arizona, but Nevada is one of the more egregious. Essentially, the legacy system lessees and owners were not, grandfathered in. So they essentially are moved immediately to the new changes, which are not very good and are slowing the market there, if not killing it entirely. And so there's a little bit of an uprising. Pretty much all the participants want the legacy system owners, lessees, to be grandfathered in, to be able to, not to move to the new system. And so there was going to be a bill to be voted on, and the Supreme Court in Nevada basically said, nope.
Yeah, right. So, it's basically like if you take out a mortgage with your bank and you sign on the dotted line and you know exactly what you're getting into, and then 1 year later, the bank just triples your rate.
Exactly. And, if you think back to when, right before the housing crash, when people were signing interest-only loans, it's not exactly analogous, but if you look at it that way, if you think your interest rate's going to stay at one point, and then boom, your interest goes up, and so does your payment, it's kind of like, ouch.
Yeah.
So what you have is the economics changing for, this is happening state by state by state, so the compromises that we've reached aren't always necessarily entirely good for the end users, owners, and lessees of systems. So essentially, you went ahead, you leased or you bought, you have a system on your roof, you're saving money. The reason you did it was so you could control your electricity bill, and then boom, there's a change. That means the reason that you did this really no longer exists. And you're seeing this market for DG solar slow all over the country.
Yeah, right. So those are numbers that you're tracking, that residential solar is?
Yes, definitely. Those are definitely numbers I'm tracking. But also, just in California, where the compromise was positive. You're going to reach a compromise, things are going to change.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, the voice of the end user really isn't in this compromise, because even though they are grandfathered and they get to keep, they don't have to pay the new fees, etc., at least for a while. But the time of use changes affect them.
Mm-hmm.
So one person in particular had a true up at the end of the year of $200, and then ended up having a choice with the time of use change shifting the peak of between 700 and 900. That's an economic change.
Wow.
So that's what's happened to all these. They feel betrayed, and I don't blame them. And it's when the court comes down and says, nope, whoops, there it is, it's done. It's not really done, because it will move on from there, but in court.
Yeah.
But it's highly disappointing and an economic disincentive to end users.
Right. Absolutely. And we do expect this to continue until we really get a handle on what to do about residential solar.
Exactly. And there's no real standard for what net metering changes are going to be state by state by state, other than the fact that there will be changes.
Yeah. All right. Let's move over to North Carolina.
All right.
Okay. So this happened. This showed up on my personal Facebook feed, posted by someone who really isn't in the industry, and just said something about how we really need better science education. A town in North Carolina voted against a solar array because they were afraid it was going to suck up all the sun.
So much to say, Jen. So much to say. What can I say? The sun is obviously a scarce resource, and the more you use of it, the less of it there is. So, of course, we will run out of sun, and solar will be entirely responsible for that, for outside, sucking up all the sun in the area. I don't know. On one hand, it's ridiculous and absurd, and on the other hand, frightening that a science teacher, who I dearly hope was misquoted, was involved in this.
The quote in the article was that the science teacher is the person that brought it up, brought that argument up.
I'm wondering if she has a science background. I know we have the story of good teachers, and teachers are the backbone of the future.
So my question is does that just point to bad science education, or is that a real message to the solar industry of hello, we really need to be doing a lot more education at even a much more basic level than maybe we realized?
Well, we've always, I'm going to take two sides of that, because one really is absurd in terms of the science teacher thinking the sun is a scarce resource, which is essentially what she's saying, I would gather. But in the solar industry, we've always needed to do more education. We don't do enough education. There are lots of excuses and reasons, most of them based on we don't have the money to do it. But, if we don't do it, then we don't move forward. It really does tag back to net metering argument. We need to get the end users involved in our political fight because they're part of the political fight. But then we need to be reached out. We need to educate. We need people to understand what their systems will provide. We need them to see what the value of it is to them. And we need them to know that solar, so I know that, and I've heard this at conferences from leasing companies, but, maybe it's others too, getting calls from customers that are saying, well, how come my system isn't, generating electricity at 9 o'clock at night? So that is almost as absurd as saying the sun is a scarce resource. So we're not doing a good enough job on educating end users, and we have to. And we cannot make the excuse that we don't have money anymore. Whether or not we don't have it, it's necessary. On the other side of it, a science teacher that would make an argument at all that the sun could possibly, is a scarce resource, it's just, there's almost nothing you can say to make that sound any weirder than it is.
Yeah, I know. That's just the strangest story. Okay, well, let's move on from there. That was just a funny little aside. Let's talk about Africa. So Renewable Energy World has been covering a lot of the developments of microgrids in Africa and electrification through solar. It's really fascinating. What's your take on it?
Well, first of all, Jen, I know you've been on safari, and I'm jealous to my very bones still. That's something I've always wanted to do. Off-grid, and Africa used to be years ago, decades ago, that's a legacy, historic market for off-grid EV. And village grids, which is really microgrids, that concept actually started in the off-grid world. That's it's been around again decades and decades and decades. Off-grid, at one point up until the early 2000s, 80% of solar deployment. So this is a real market operating the way a real market operates. That's what I mean. They're typically non-subsidized, and so essentially, the end users pay the value of that electricity for them. So that is no problems with education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I can say is, I've seen what I will say on the negative side is I've seen, mandates from governments come and go. Almost all of them, and almost all of them in the off-grid world, developing world, are not fully implemented. And the reason is economics. It costs money to do it. And then you're dealing with typically very poor populations that, though these village grids or microgrids is what they are, profoundly changes lives. Gives, you can have a village that suddenly can have the internet, that can suddenly do business across the world. So it's an amazing, wonderful thing. But they're very poor communities, and they often cannot pay for it. So they can't. So you have situations where they may not be able to pay 1 month, and so they don't have electricity. Then they pay the next month, and they do have electricity. You also have to educate the people talking about so that they don't overuse and end up, so everybody has to sort of conserve. And so education, maintenance, ongoing maintenance, often these things are forgotten, by the way, with wonderful government programs. They forget that ongoing maintenance is necessary,
Yeah.
education is necessary, training is necessary, affordability is key. It's not new.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. I mean,
but it's always wonderful to see the continuation of the goal of providing electricity there.
yeah, I mean, the cool thing is that they figured out how to let people use their cell phones to pay for their solar electricity. And that, I mean, and I can tell you when I was there, everybody has a cell phone. I mean, they may not have, they may live in a hut with a dirt floor, but they have a cell phone.
Yeah, the proliferation of cell phones is amazing. I did a report on cell phones over 20 years ago, and people who know me, visionary and me don't belong in the same sort of sentence, but
You're definitely a realist.
But basically, I was vastly underestimated the proliferation of cell phones, and I was arguing with that I was having a way too optimistic forecast.
Wow.
So yeah, in Africa, countries in Africa are well ahead of us, the rest of the world, and paying for things with cell phone, getting rid of paper money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so they're skipping the grid, right? They skipped the telecom grid, and hopefully they will be able to skip the electricity grid and just use.
Not necessarily true. You still, cell phones are still operating. There's still a technology that needs to be in place. And by the way, solar is in remote areas where you do have cell phone towers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I read about this in my annual global analysis in depth. Solar is one of the primary technologies for those remote cell towers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it really, still need some way for the signal to get from A to B, or C to D, whatever. And again, village grids they're not new. Methods to using cell phones as a method to pay for the electricity, that's relatively recent.
Yeah.
And, could teach the rest of the world a lesson, honestly, even the grid-connected world.
Yeah, I know. And we'll continue on that thread next time on 3 at 3 on Solar PV. Thanks, Paula.
Bye, Jen.
Bye, Paula.